The fine-tuning argument is essentially a contemporary version of the design argument for God. Its structure is fundamentally like Paley's watchmaker analogy, which claims that the complexity of the universe is more likely the result of an intelligent creator than of nature alone. This argument is often met with groans of disapproval today, likely because we have done a great job at understanding how complexity arises. For example, by evolution, and perhaps the world does not strike us with such unaccountable awe any longer. The fine-tuning argument simply purports to have extremely good and also scientific evidence for the low probability of life given naturalism, by noting how several physical constants could not have been even a fraction different, talking less than a billionth of a percent, without changing the universe so that life did not exist at all. Quite a coincidence then, that the universe just so happens to be set up as such that life does exist. The argument makes the claim that, because of the fine-tuning of constants, life is far more likely to arise given theism than naturalism, and as such the discovery of fine-tuned constants should, as Bayesian statistics suggest, undermine our confidence in naturalism. And so it is left for us to decide whether the probability of life given naturalism really is lower than its probability given theism, and if so, by how much. One of the most frequent and notable objections to the argument makes the claim that attributing any probability to the chance of life given naturalism is entirely erroneous. We have little to no knowledge about what probabilities there could have possibly been for other values of the physical constants. For all we know, in fact, the constants could be as they are by virtue of necessity, and the chance that our very constants exist are, well, 1, rather than a fraction of a percent. And for the naturalist who might already employ the concept of necessity to explain something like the origins of existence, this could make perfect sense. The naturalist might critique the kind of probabilistic reasoning which the theist is using here, namely approaching the evidence from an a priori standpoint, criticizing this approach as something which neglects the evidence before us. I'd like you to imagine, however, a world filled with the evidence which you would need to begin believing in God. This could be a world filled with what appear to be angels, singing praises to God and making predictions for the future which seem to come true without fail. Messages from God spelled out in the clouds for all to see, and other seeming miracles all around. Now consider that it is also perfectly possible that all of these happenings are just an extreme coincidence in the physical world, and no God exists. It is coherent to posit that the physical laws and original conditions of the universe just so happen to dictate this outcome by necessity, but we have extremely little reason to believe in this in the face of the alternative hypothesis. It is not that this world of angels itself is likely given the existence of God per se, since there are boundless other worlds a God might have created. It's just that the likelihood of it coming about given naturalism is so much lower that it should sway our beliefs. But this evidence is by all means the same type of evidence as the fine-tuning of constants, just to an even more extreme degree. Perhaps another account of knowledge can explain why the extreme scenario should sway our beliefs, and fine-tuning shouldn't. Perhaps we would be becoming acquainted with God's very existence directly, but this isn't really satisfactory, for most of the evidence of this kind which would sway our beliefs doesn't seem to be acquaintance, nor does it particularly help us determine how confident we should be in our beliefs in the first place. Necessity then, though coherent, fails to justify our beliefs for the reason that we have no account of why necessity would be compatible with life. Indeed, there is nothing at all which inherently links naturalism to life. And until we can provide some explanation as to why naturalism must facilitate life, our confidence in naturalism should always be undermined somewhat. The explanation from necessity could even be used to defend any worldview, no matter how ridiculous it seems. And clearly then, we need to reintroduce some of the a priori probabilistic reasoning to determine how justified we are in doing so. I think two things are potentially happening here. First, our a priori probabilistic reasoning is usually much more complex than it is given credit for, and our confidence in naturalism and theism alike are already influenced by countless of instances of small types of this reasoning. One thought experiment concocted to critique this type of reasoning shows a bag full of red and black beans. asking one to calculate the probability that the 5 black beans will end on top of 95 red beans after being shaken in a bag randomly. Intuitively, one thinks the chance is extremely low, but after the bag is shaken, the black beans end up on top practically every time, for the reason that they are very slightly bigger. This is used to argue how erroneous our a priori approach to probabilities can be. But the absurdity of the outcome compared to our original estimations does not reflect what is really happening in this situation. Our estimates work on the assumption that the beans are equal in color only, and it is this assumption which is irrational, not the approach in general. It's likely influenced, in fact, by the context with which we usually face these types of questions, namely in maths tests, etc. Without any irrational bias, one might assume that, without further evidence, there is a 1/3 chance that the black beans are larger, equal, or smaller. They are more likely to end up on top the 1/3 of the time that they are larger. If one takes into account the context of the thought experiment being proposed as well, this chance probably increases even further, given that the experiment is designed to trick one into guessing an extremely low probability. And then when we take this proper approach to probabilities, given the context that we find ourselves in, we end up assigning a probability that looks more reasonable. And our guesses were only ever irrationally far off because we did not take this situation into account. The chance in the end turns out to be almost 100% that the black beans end up on top. But this does not mean that at any point it was rational for us to have a high level of confidence in the proposition. And so we have reason to have more faith in the a priori type of probabilistic reasoning which is going on here, especially since it seems we need it to account for the extreme evidence in the situation that we just discussed. And so we have reason to conclude that necessity alone has very little explanatory power. If we cannot flesh out a link between our attraction towards necessity and such and its link to life-friendly conditions. The second point of confusion comes from misappropriating how much the success of the fine-tuning argument should affect one's belief in God. This graph demonstrates the changes to the two hypotheses of naturalism and theism if we use Bayesian statistics. Here we see what happens if we assume that after considering fine-tuning as new evidence, there is only a 0.25 chance in life given naturalism, compared to a chance of practically 1 given theism. This 0.25 chance represents the chance that something such as a multiverse exists, or conditions where the physical constants can change over an extremely long duration or across multiple universes. Were one to grant theism a 1% likelihood of a full fine-tuning, the probability of theism afterwards would rise to almost 4%. With the chance of the multiverse model increasing drastically and other forms of naturalism vanishing in their likelihood. And so a person's 1% inclination towards theism would increase, but not necessarily by enough to make the existence of God more likely than not. And perhaps a resistance to the argument itself comes from the accurate feeling that one's beliefs are being asked to move more than they really should. And for those that question as to whether we can know the motives of God, it is absolutely true that fine-tuning might be evidence for certain conceptions of God more than others, but it does fit well with the gods spoken most about in theism and apologetics, so we will leave this problem today. Here we see what happens if we assume that the fine-tuning of constants should not have happened any more than 10% of the time given naturalism. This would transform a belief that there be a 10% chance of God's existence to over 50%. And so the naturalist can still offer a coherent and even compelling account of fine-tuning, the existence of a multiverse or infinite time through which physical constants change. But we now have to ask ourselves, what probability would have been rational to assign to these hypotheses before considering the evidence of fine-tuning? It seems to require two important assumptions, both of which could only be vaguely likely at best. The first is the existence of a multiverse or of infinite time, something which we have very little evidence for, except perhaps by way of argument, that if our universe came into existence, it did so in a way unbounded by external forces, and therefore the existence of other universes is also more likely than not. But assigning a probability anywhere far north of 50% for this claim might be a stretch. The more problematic assumption is that the laws of physics might be able to change in an appropriate way for this picture. We have never observed that the laws of physics can change, and without considering fine-tuning, it was widely thought that they could not change at all. Our same inclination towards necessity, which we expressed earlier, reflects the idea that we think something might be fixed in regards to these laws. Furthermore, there are far more possible ranges with which the constants could have varied that exclude life-friendly conditions than there are that include them. So the naturalists better find a reason to argue that it is more likely that the range of possible values is infinite, or else coalesces around these life-friendly conditions. Otherwise, confidence in naturalism should be diluted even further. The chance of this assumption being true I would therefore take to be less than 0.5 before considering fine-tuning, and for that reason a probability of 0.25 for life given naturalism I take to be a fairly reasonable upper bound. So in conclusion, the fine-tuning argument is significant, and I believe it should greatly increase the probability with which one thinks God would be real, though not necessarily by enough to make theism more likely than not. You can assess how much fine-tuning should increase your own confidence in God by evaluating what chance you would have attributed to God's existence before considering fine-tuning, and the probability of life-facilitating conditions given naturalism, and running it through the Bayesian formula. As we have discussed, it's hard to see how one can offer a good explanation for fine-tuning without assuming conditions where the constants have an extraordinary ability to range across time or space. But prior to learning of fine-tuning, what reason would one really have to believe in this? I certainly could not justify thinking there to have been any more than a 25% chance, and therefore the chance of God's existence should significantly increase. Fine-tuning does constitute evidence for things such as the multiverse, but also as evidence for theism at the same time. And finally, one might appeal to a lack of knowledge as a way out, claiming that science does not yet have all the answers, but in the future most likely will. But I stress that there is a distinction between what science will explain and the problem of how likely naturalism is to produce life. Science will fill gaps in our knowledge about why the world behaves as it does, but never as to why life is to be expected under naturalism by principle. It could explain how life arises, but naturalism itself is uninterested in life for all we know. To wait for science to explain why life would be likely is not science, it's dogma, and it is a different hope than waiting on science to explain how the world will work in general. The existence of life will always undermine naturalism until we have demonstrated that naturalism can guarantee life. The conversation is simply about degree. And even if one day we do demonstrate the existence of an infinite multiverse, it does not mean that in the here and now, it was not rational for us to doubt naturalism as a result of fine-tuning. Sometimes, and as I hope I have demonstrated here, the God of the gaps is a perfectly rational answer. And whether the God of the gaps objection will truly ever disappear and cease to be rational, I have my doubts. And I would urge anyone interested to watch my previous video exploring exactly that topic. How no matter how far we expand our linguistic explanatory power, the God of the gaps remains an entirely rational answer to many questions. An interesting side note is how much of our lack of faith in fine-tuning given naturalism is a result of our prior belief in theism. In particular, our very conceptions of the origins of existence have been deeply shaped by the Christian notion of creation from nothing, and this understanding of creation no doubt plays a large part in the incredulity of our fine-tuned constants, perceiving them as a fluke which came from nothing but mere chance. But I believe the science which fuels our belief in naturalism is influenced by this very same attitude towards creation also, and upon reflection, a world not influenced by this principle might look very different to the one we believe ourselves to be in, theist and naturalist alike. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please share your thoughts below in the comments, and hopefully we can figure out more of the truth of this together. Love and peace.